Now, heading into our second game, we have Magnus Carlsen versus Sergey Karjakin from the 2019 Gashima Memorial. All right, in the game, Sergey opens 1e4, Magnus responds 1c5, the Sicilian defense, and from there they head straight for that Sveshnikov variation that we saw in game number 1, finally with the key move e5, then knight b5, and d6. Now, this game was played very shortly after the World Championship match in 2018, where Fabiano Caruana went knight d5 repeatedly against Magnus Carlsen, and here Sergey wanted to challenge Magnus Carlsen's preparation, so he also goes for this line knight to d5. Now here, of course, the threat is knight to c7. Black has to take the knight. White takes back. And here in the last game, we saw Magnus go knight to b8. That is the technically a little bit better and more solid move. However, in this game, Magnus actually goes knight to e7, the more combative and double-edged idea. Now, obviously, from here, Black has one less piece on the queen side defending and one more piece on the king side. And that may mean Black can get an attack going on the king side. Of course, the big problem with this move is that knight does block the bishop on f8. Bishop e7 is not possible. Black may have to go knight to f5 or knight g6, and that knight may be vulnerable to h4 to h5 ideas, trying to knock it off the g6 square. So overall, very interesting idea from Black. Now here's Sergey goes with c4, expanding on the queen side. This does set up the idea of queen to a4, as we're going to see just in one moment. Here Magnus does go knight to g6, and Sergey goes queen to a4, setting up those discovered checks on the king. Of course, if Black does nothing, say h6, then knight to c7 is going to be absolutely devastating. So you have to respond to that threat immediately. So what are Black's options in this position? Well, the only good move for Black is to block the check with the bishop. So bishop d7 on the board. Of course, now the knight is pinned and Black is threatening a6 ideas. White's going to have to do something about that. So here's Sergey goes queen to b4, putting pressure on that pawn on the d6 square. Now, of course, the knight and the queen are attacking it. Black only has that bishop on f8 defending. Therefore, Black's got to do something about it. Here, he simply goes bishop f5, so that bishop on d7 served its purpose. No longer needed to block queen to a4 ideas, so bishop f5 on the board. Now that pawn is defended by the queen and the bishop. Now here, if White wants it, he can actually go for a draw immediately. Here, Sergey does go queen to a4, once again with those discovered threats. Here, Black has to go bishop d7, and here's Sergey once again, queen b4, bishop f5 on the board, and if Sergey wanted it, queen to a4 and then bishop d7 would be a threefold repetition. It'd be the third time the players had this move in a row, and therefore the game would be a draw effective immediately. Now, fortunately for us, Sergey did not do that. He came ready in this game. Here, this position expands on the king side with the move h4. Now, this is a very double-edged idea. Obviously, that pawn on h4 could be taken by the knight on g6. However, taking the pawn with the knight would actually be a big blunder. Therefore, h4 works out. Now, real fast, if you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to figure out why knight takes h4 is not a good idea for Black and why Magnus skipped the idea in the game. Well, I hope you found it. If you did, kudos to you, my friend. Obviously, the idea here is if the knight does take on h4, it is defended by the queen. However, the queen does need to defend that c7 square. So effectively here, the queen is overloaded, and for that reason, rook takes h4 is the move. And here, Black cannot take the rook. If he does, queen takes h4 is met by knight to c7, winning the other rook on the a8 square. And for that reason, after rook takes h4, Black cannot take back the rook, and here Black is basically just down a minor piece for almost nothing. So obviously, knight takes h4, not the ideal move for Magnus Carlsen. Instead here, what should he do? Well, one idea is a6, try to attack the knight immediately, but then White has the idea of h5. Things get very, very messy there. For example, a6, and instead of defending the knight to a3 or knight c3, you can actually go h5 immediately, hitting the knight. And again, this would be an absolute mess over the board that would probably favor White. So with that in mind, here Magnus plays the more human-looking idea, simply h5, expanding on the king side and stopping the advance of White's pawn. Now, the drawback of this move, obviously, is that pawn no longer can defend the g5 square. Therefore, bishop g5 ideas for White are going to be strong. And that is what White plays in the game. Bishop g5 on the board. Of course, the other idea may have been bishop to e3, trying to put pressure on that pawn on the a7 square. Now here, the queen on d8 is being attacked by the bishop. What does Magnus do in the game? He goes queen to b8. Now, this is the best square for the queen. It looks a little bit awkward, But of course, black does have to maintain defense of that pawn on the d6 square. It is being attacked twice by the knight and the queen. Therefore, the queen has to remain defending it for now. So, all that being said, queen b8, literally the only good move for black in that position. Now, here's Sergey, goes bishop e2, putting pressure on that pawn on the h5 square. Very good. It's going to be tough for black to actually castle here. So, for example, if black were to go bishop e7, then short castles, that rook no longer defends the h5 pawn. That is another disadvantage of that h5 move that Magnus played earlier. Still a good move, but certainly some drawbacks to it. Now, here, Magnus, he goes a6, trying to knock back the knight from the b5 square. Very good move. Sergey goes knight to c3. And here, Magnus plays a move that I had a little bit of a hard time understanding at first when I first saw this game live. Queen to c7. Now, this is sort of a waiting move. The queen wasn't doing a very good job on the back rank. Now the rook can come into play. And the reason this move works here is black really doesn't have another better option. Bishop e7 is playable here. But then white can take on e7, and black isn't really in a hurry to castle because that pawn on the h5 square would hang. There are some other ideas that are possible. Knight to f4, for example, is possible as well. But those ideas, bishop e7 and knight to f4, black really isn't in a hurry to play them. Therefore, queen c7, a solid regrouping idea, does make some sense. Now here, Sergey has a similar sort of problem. He doesn't really have a clear way to break through with the position. Therefore, he plays some normal developing moves. g3 here, bolstering that pawn on the h4 square. This allows the bishop to come back, and potentially white can also castle without sacrificing that pawn on h4. Now here, Magnus, bishop e7, offering the trade of bishops on the g5 square. White declines, bishop e3. And here, Magnus gains space in the middle of the board with the move e4. This is a very committal idea. It's seen quite a bit in the English attack against the Sveshnikov Sicilian. If you play the English attack as white or as black, you'll probably recognize this pawn structure here. It is literally a carbon copy of that Najdorf-style pawn structure after white goes knight d5, and then black takes on d5 with his bishop or his knight. Now, what's the idea behind this move e4? Well, black is gaining space in the center and setting up knight to d5 ideas. That knight's going to be very strong on e5 in the future. Perhaps it wants to go to f3 or d3. And beyond that, there are bishop f6 ideas trying to put pressure on this long diagonal here with the bishop. So e4, very strong idea. The only drawback, of course, is that pawn is no longer defended by the pawn on the d6 square. That means that bishop on f5 is going to need to defend it for a while. Now here, we pretty much reached the critical position in the game for white. The opening phase of the game is effectively over, and white needs to find a plan. Now here, castling on the king side and on the queen side are both very playable options. They lead to wildly different positions, but they're both approximately equally good. And personally, I thought Sergey would go long castles here. It kind of seemed consistent with his entire plan so far in this game, expanding on the king side with h4, going for a more combative approach. However, instead of this, Sergey actually castles short on the king side. Now, this may look safer. After all, white does have these pawns on f2, g3, and h4 on the king side, whereas his queen side pawns are a little bit more further advanced. However, here, black has the option of going knight to e5 immediately. From there, he's going to have access to the f3 square with the knight, and eventually the queen can come to d7, trying to infiltrate on the light squares on the king side. So overall, this does not really look that much safer for white than castling on the queen side. Now here, Magnus, what should he do? Well, knight to e5 is the most logical looking move at first glance. However, Magnus goes for a different idea. He actually castles on the king side, giving up that pawn on the h5 square. And it turns out this is by far the best move in the position. Now, of course, white can't win that pawn immediately. That is what Sergey does. So where is black's compensation coming from? Well, first of all, white does have pressure on that knight on g6. Black's got to move it. Knight to e5, finally on the board. Now here, Sergey retreats the bishop back to the e2 square. The bishop did its job on h5, so now simply retreating back to a more centralized square in the position. Now, again, here, Magnus Carlsen is down a clean pawn. There's no obvious compensation, so why did he short castle in that position? Well, here is the start of his plan. Queen d7. Magnus is going to have to infiltrate with the queen on the light squares in some capacity. He might threaten bishop g4 next. Then if white takes on g4, queen takes g4 would be the move. And from there, maybe Magnus Carlsen can get something going in the game. Now here, Sergey goes queen to a4, trying to offer a trade of the queens, but Magnus declines. Queen to c8, keeping the queen on this diagonal here. and keeping the queens on the board. So excellent idea. Of course, if Magnus were to trade queens, say queen takes to a4, then knight takes, suddenly Black's attack is over. He's down a pawn for effectively nothing, and this would be a disastrous endgame for Black. Now, back to the game. Queen to c8 on the board by Magnus. Now, here's Sergey. Once again, another very critical position. What should he be doing here? In the game, he tries to get something going on the queen side immediately, and he does that with the move c5. Now, this is a very committal idea. Instead of this, the computer likes the idea of simply queen d1, retreating the queen, trying to get the queen closer to the defense of the king. Of course, that would drop the pawn on the c4 square, for example, queen d1. Then the sequence is knight takes c4, bishop takes, queen takes, and overall, this position is roughly level. The attack is mostly over as the queen is so far away from the king side here. There's no easy way to transfer the queen over. So overall, queen d1 would have been a very simple playable idea for Sergey. Instead, c5 on the board, again, trying to get his queenside play going faster, but it doesn't seem to work out as well here. Here, Black takes on c5, d takes c5. It's a very committal move because now that pawn on d5 is a pass pawn. However, Magnus believes it's not an issue in this position. Now from here, Sergey is showing one of the ideas of c5. Of course, in this position, the queen does not have access to that e4 pawn, but as soon as you go c5, suddenly the queen does have access to it, and for that reason, after d takes c5, here Sergey goes knight takes e4, the knight being defended by the queen, of course, so bishop takes e4 is not a threat yet. Now here, instead of taking on e4 immediately, Magnus just goes c4, a very committal idea. The idea is you're blocking off the queen's communication with the knight. And beyond that, of course, b5 is now a threat, expanding on the queen side and trying to maintain that pawn on the c4 square. So here, white has to respond to all of those threats immediately. Now, the only good ideas here for Sergey are going to be knight to c3, getting the knight out of the attack of the bishop, or perhaps queen to c2. Now, the computer loves the idea of queen c2. The idea being this pin from the bishop isn't that big of a deal. You can follow up with rook a d1, and your rooks are very well placed on the open d files and perhaps the e file as well. Instead, knight to c3 is what Sergey played. Now, the advantage, of course, is the queen is not being pinned by the bishop on the c2 square. However, here, Black can go b5 immediately. That is what Magnus does. And now, obviously, the c2 square is not available for the queen. a3 not available as the bishop guards that square. So really, the only good retreat square for the queen is going to be d1. And now, of course, it would be better to have a rook on the d1 square instead of the queen, but instead the queen is there, and that's going to hurt white's development a little bit. Now here, Magnus, he expands on the queen side with the move b4, dislodging the knight from the c3 square. Again, this is slightly committal. Those pawns could be weak on the queen side. However, for now, they're perfectly fine. White does not have a good way to put pressure on them. So now, where's the knight going to go? Obviously, going back to the b1 square, not a good option. e4 is guarded. Therefore, the only really viable square is a4, and here the knight is starting to look a little bit misplaced there. Now, of course, the threat here for white is knight to b6, forking both the queen on the c8 square and the rook on the a8 square. So how does Magnus deal with that threat? Well, he sort of doesn't. He goes bishop e4. Now the idea is if white goes knight to b6, Black's queen is going to jump in to the h3 square, and from there he's actually threatening checkmate in one move, queen to g2, checkmate. So obviously knight b6, not a good idea anymore. Here white goes queen d4, putting pressure on that knight on e5. Decent idea. Then queen f5 from Black, obviously defending the knight. And now here, of course, Black is threatening ideas like knight to f3 check. Try to block that pawn on f2. If Black gets that in, it's going to be incredibly difficult for white to defend. He's going to be too weak on the light squares. So that in mind, his main ideas may be f3 or f4. Again, trying to preemptively stop knight to f3 from Black. Now, in the game, Sergey does go f4. This move is okay. However, Magnus has a great response. Queen g6, putting pressure on that pawn on the g3 square. And Magnus Carlsen's attack continues. Now, real fast, I do want to show you, instead of f4, the key idea for white may have been f3 in this position. Now, things get absolutely crazy in this line. I don't want to go down it too much. For example, here, Black can take the pawn right away, but then white can actually sacrifice the rook. The idea is rook takes, and then after bishop takes, you go rook to f1 with the pin on the bishop. Then Black can go bishop f6, putting pressure on the queen. I mean, the line goes on and on. It's simply wild. All this to say, overall, f3 may have been the stronger move, but it's far more complicated. Instead, Sergey plays the more human-looking idea, f4, stopping the idea of knight to f3 once and for all, and it doesn't lose a pawn immediately. However, of course, all of those light squares around the white king are incredibly weak, and here queen g6, again, putting pressure on g3, it's very hard to meet. Now here Sergey does go bishop f2, of course that defends for now, but then Magnus jumps in with the knight to d3. Now that knight is targeting the bishop. If the bishop falls, g3 is going to be under a lot more pressure. What does Sergey do here? Well, first of all, taking the knight on the d3 square isn't that great of an idea. For example, if white takes, black doesn't have to take with the bishop. Instead, he can actually go c takes d3, keeping the bishop on the e4 square where it targets the white king side, and that pawn on d3 is surprisingly strong here. Now, bishop takes d3 was a playable move. It will be playable in the future as well. Instead of that, Sergey goes h5, putting pressure on the queen, asking the queen where it's going to go. In the game, Magnus goes queen f5, logical move. Obviously, from f5, the queen does threaten queen to h3, and then, again, queen g2 checkmate, so white's going to have to be on guard about that. Now, here the best move is finally bishop takes d3. White delayed it one move by going h5 first, but at this point, you basically have to take the knight on the d3 square. Now, instead, here Sergey goes for a different idea. Bishop g4. Now, this doesn't lose a piece. Obviously, the queen on f5 is being overloaded. If it takes the bishop, then queen takes e4 is possible. That is what happens in the game. Queen takes g4, then queen takes e4. However, again, without that light-squared bishop on the board, it's going to be hard for white to defend the king side. Now black just goes bishop d6, a very good move. He's setting up the idea of rook a to e8, putting pressure on the queen on the e4 square. So now, what is white supposed to do? In the game, queen g2, and then rook a to e8 from black. Now Magnus has all sorts of threats. For example, rook to e2 may be coming soon. I mean, white is technically hanging on for now, but his position is just absolutely horrendous overall. Here Sergey goes bishop d4, trying to defend, but then black starts by taking that pawn on the h5 square, queen takes h5, and then after queen to f3 offering the queen trade, queen g6, putting pressure on g3. Black is even threatening knight takes f4 now, as the pawn is pinned, and obviously if the queen takes back on f4, then bishop takes f4 wins the queen, so that would be no good. Here Sergey tries to defend with the move king to h1, getting the king off that g-file, therefore knight takes f4 or bishop takes is not a threat. However, here black just jumps in with the rook to the e4 square, rook to e4. The idea is then rook to e8 next, doubling out the rooks, perhaps going rook to e2, and white is just in so much trouble. White retreats the bishop and rook f to e8, as we discussed. And here in this position, white actually, or Sergey Karjakin, actually resigned on the spot to Magnus Carlsen, and here's why. The computer says the best move for white here is a3, believe it or not. There's almost nothing he can do productively here. Then black just takes the bishop on f2, and if the queen takes back, perhaps the best move. Then rook to e2 is absolutely devastating. Black's going to have threats along the h-file. After the queen moves, for example, then queen to h5 check into the king. And overall, there isn't a whole lot white can do to stave off checkmate. So for that reason, Sergey Karjakin resigned to Magnus Carlsen. He had had enough. Wow, what a game by both players.